What if the scientific revolution wasn't science escaping Christianity, but in fact science built on Christian beliefs about the world? In this episode, we go back to early modern Europe to ask how faith may have helped or hindered the rise of modern science. We also want to examine how a faith-driven revolution could have led to godless scientific materialism that we know today. If you've always heard that the church and science are opposed or at odds, this conversation may be for you. It might change your mind about the church and about the lab. This is the No Brain Left Behind podcast.
Well, the thing that is the most intriguing to me is about this topic is that I grew up in the 90s and 2000s, and I think the underlying assumption for all of science was that basically it's somehow at odds with theism or Christian faith. And when I came to understand that that's sort of where people were as scientists, like all scientists are atheists or something like that, it really kind of put the fear in me of, well, shoot, man, maybe none of this is real at all. Maybe Christian faith isn't real or belief in God can't be real. And then I realized as I started doing research in these types of things that the reality of the scientific method, which is really powerfully explanatory and useful, that reality and some of the shifts in modern culture and the scientific revolution are not actually at odds with a theistic belief at all. So the reason that we're here, where these things seem opposed, is more like an accident of history and genealogy rather than a necessity. Is that...
Can you explain this? First of all, what did you discover that changed your mind? And what did you mean by the last part?
Well, one thing I discovered that changed my mind was that a belief in God is in no way opposed to the idea that humans have rationality and can apply that rationality to the world to gain knowledge.
What convinced you of that fact?
That's a good question. What convinced me of that fact?
I can give you an answer if you want to.
Sure.
If you want to pause and think about it.
Yeah, I can think about it. Yeah,
I had a really similar upbringing, and I didn't so much see all like the scientific method as at odds with Christianity or the church or faith. I saw that the findings that came out, as what they were presented to me as, like incredibly biased and erroneous. So they can't be trusted. You can still do science. You can still trust medicine. You can still trust, like we went to the moon and all that, those kind of things. But you can't trust certain aspects of what the scientific community tell you based off of bias. And so a lot of what I knew about science growing up was not actually how to do science, but you were kind of trained to identify the scientific discoveries that were biased. So you were trained on like the hot button issues, and it felt very political. That's what it was for me, and it only ended that way. That only ended that like widespread distrust of the scientific community as it exists now. When I was in college, and I was in a course that was called Creation Studies. And it's a mandatory course at the Christian school I went to. And
what was the name of the school?
Liberty University.
In Virginia.
In Virginia, which I love. I loved my experience there, and I think that they're great. And I would say, by and large, this isn't a good representation of what they are as an educational institution. They're really great. But this was a pretty dogmatic course about creation studies, arguing with a geologist arguing that he actually knew the real age of the Earth and of the universe, and that started some big questions with me. And I started just getting on YouTube, looking around, and I found a guy out of MIT named Gerald Schroeder, who had like literally a YouTube video, 5-minute explanation for the age of the universe, and it didn't, and it was based in a belief in God, and showed how an old universe was still really consistent with what we know about God from the Bible and what we know about science.
So it was at
now.
odds. What you watched was at odds with your course on creation that you received.
What was funny is it was at odds with the course, but I saw that this person's take on faith and his understanding of physics were more refined than what I was getting in this course. And I went, well, I'm going to go towards this because this seems more honest. And it seems it's
Okay, so that's really important. Like, what did you perceive as honesty that you did not see in Virginia at Liberty versus the video that you watched?
So first of all, I actually just kind of felt at some level that it just didn't make sense that a geologist would be the authority on age of the universe. I was like, well, geology is about Earth. You know, like you're studying rocks.
So is this like a
physicist?
He was out of his lane.
Yeah, you know, I
Didn't like it.
it was easy for me to make the correlation between like, okay, your cosmology probably isn't as strong as physicists from MIT as a geologist at Liberty University. And it's nothing against the academic quality. They're great. Let me just reiterate. But I just saw that they were a little bit out of their lane arguing that. He was like, you're a little bit out of your depth here. This guy has created a really strong and very compelling case for an old universe that can be supported with biblical text, and he actually brought in a lot of like church fathers and
was an identifying Christian, right?
I actually don't know if he was a Christian.
Okay.
He may have been Jewish.
Okay.
But what was his background, scientific background?
He was a tenured physicist professor at MIT.
So he was more qualified than your teacher, would you say?
Well, yeah, and he was a
field?
physicist too. And I was like, well, I already knew that physicist was a much harder science than geology.
More difficult, you mean?
Yeah, well, I guess harder is maybe, you know, that's maybe kind of a offhand way to describe the sciences. But you have like more, a narrower interpretation of the data with physics and mathematics than you do with like, say, biology and geology. At least that's how
I don't know about that, but it's definitely it's a segment of science, and it's probably more narrow. Like what you learn in physics is more widely applicable, more easily applicable to different realms. So, for example, I studied band theory and semiconductors. It's still quantum physics. I could expand my knowledge in certain directions that would cover more physics than geology would be able to by trying to go to cosmology. It would be more difficult. It should be more obvious.
And I didn't know that. Right. I just felt that.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you look at somebody in their eyes as they're explaining something like this, and I had no reason to believe this guy. I was at an institution that pretty much wholesale supports the guy that's teaching my class. My family believes pretty much wholesale what this guy's teaching his class. My girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, believed pretty much the same thing. We were in the same class together too. We had organized our little schedule, and we both went through this kind of change. She learned the same way growing up. We both went through this big change at the same time, shifting our. It wasn't even a shift. It was a broadening of our understanding of the world. I was like,
it's crazy because, again, I'm going to bring up the book by Augustine, 415 AD, so 5th century, early 5th century, which is exactly more, I guess, open-minded than most teachings that you might have received, you know, in the 1990s or in the 2000s.
But here's actually something that was probably a mercy for me, is that the context of this kind of newfound discovery for me was in this environment that already philosophically and theologically I had a deep understanding in community there. So for me to have this pretty jarring, like, I'm pretty sure this is wrong. Pretty sure this understanding's wrong and this is right. It didn't cause me to like fall off the beanstalk and be like, you know what, I'm out.
Right.
Because it happens. It happened to a ton
to
of my
Taylor.
friends.
Well, I think it's actually the story of the scientific revolution was that these moments of progress in our understanding of the natural universe did actually cause people to, what do you say, fall off the beanstalk, you know? And so it didn't happen with you, I think, because you had enough wherewithal to maybe see that there were still underlying connections. For me, I was pretty shaken by the idea that, oh man, these must be presuppositions that actually go against theological presuppositions. And to answer your question, as I was thinking about it as you were talking, how did I get to a place where I might, you say, like, learned the difference or learned better? It was actually when I started being exposed to some of these people like Johannes Kepler and the idea and the fact that they're deeply religious people whose theistic beliefs actually grounded what they had to say about the universe and how it existed. So it wasn't as if people who did not believe in God went away in a cloister and came up with all of this knowledge about the universe and then came back and said, haha, we've disproved your God.
This is exactly my point.
Yeah.
This is exactly my point, that I noticed that in general, while we go to school and we learn about history of science is completely neglected, and it's exactly Stephen Meyer's specialty. It is a historian, a philosopher of science, and it is also the field that I love, and it is a field that I discovered very, very late. I did not even know it existed. And so it is basically about this. It's the history. It's learning about how ideas were, published, how they were challenged, how different thinkers built on each other's results over time, how they contradicted each other, and how you had paradigm shifts, just like Kuhn describes in his seminal book of 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Okay. So you have we learn Newton's laws, we learn different things at school, and we never connect the dots historically how things came about. And when you start digging, first of all, you understand that it is not really a revolution. It is not a burst of information out of nowhere. It is a progression. And number two, when you get to know the people, they're overwhelmingly Christian, strong Christian, very, 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 at least moderate Christians or believers, and very rarely, in very rare cases, they're skeptics. Until the middle of the 19th century, and I would say until Huxley maybe and Darwin. So teaching the philosophy and the history of science is an eye-opener. So if ever you're a teacher listening, a professor listening, a pastor listening, a key really to break away from dogmatism and from this kind of having our faith shaken when we discover something randomly is to really push people to understand how scientific results came about. And scientific revolution is basically part of this. Of this
just
history.
the history of thought in general, would you say?
I would say so. Yeah.
I think probably essentially, and I may have said this before already, that probably the thing that was the most jarring for me to leave was a binary understanding of the history of science, or the history of science in the church. Like you're in one camp or the other. You actually have to leave that to discover the truth. And that binary, that, like, as much as the church or Christians would like to blame that, on the secular scientific community, it's actually, it takes two to tango. That drawing away, and in that drawing away, you get worse ideas. Like, so when you have that, and I hope I'm explaining myself. It takes to get a real true discovery.
So who's tangoing here? Who are
the church and science?
Okay.
As this kind of and it's largely unspoken, I think, by people doing actual science, like doing discovery. They don't talk about it so much. Like, I'm doing this from a Christian perspective or a faith perspective, or I'm doing this from a secular perspective. But they do exist on that spectrum. And only when you kind of move away from that and go, you know what, I'm actually just going to purely enjoy the discovery process, do you actually begin to yield the fruit from science? And
I disagree with you.
Okay.
Because all the records that we have from, let's say, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Maxwell, they heavily included in their writings equations interspersed with almost psalmic worship, to God the Creator.
Yeah.
So
their
motivation was heavily.
I see what you're saying exactly. I think then I would reframe it, because I believe that. But it was, I think the term that I was searching for, and this is what it is you have to stop defending these positions. Trying to
in the name of God, you mean?
Yeah, you don't need to defend,
or in the name of non-God.
You don't need to defend the church from new scientific discoveries, and you don't need to defend new scientific discoveries from the church. You don't need to defend it.
Right.
It's all in this.
But we've been made to think that you do.
That's what you have to leave. I had to stop being so defensive about
I get you.
my Christian background, And then, because that's what Newton was doing, what you described Newton doing, and a host of others, is they weren't being defensive. In fact, they were actually being offensive against some dogmatic church beliefs, which is like, that's the backdrop of the scientific revolution, is you had like an Inquisition happening.
Sure.
The Roman Catholic Church was getting super draconian. Galileo was forced to say, I won't talk about Copernicus and his ideas. And there's a whole background of that. Like, there was this defensiveness. Mm-hmm. That's what I was pointing out. It's not that you have to just leave your Christian faith behind or leave your. It's not.
I think you're right.
It's a pushing forward and going. This isn't going to shake that.
And so, as a kid growing up in the '90s and 2000s, that existed. That sort of two silos just existed. I think, where you could either be a Christian and check rationality at the door because Christians believe that a dead man got out of a grave and that there's a God, or you can believe in science and be a rational person. That's sort of the dichotomy that I feel like I grew up in. And as I began to be educated to think seriously about these things, I realized that is an utterly false dichotomy. I do appreciate that distinction that you're bringing up.
It is true what you said, and also it also is important to clarify with Galileo, for example, that it was also not really true, I would say, at the time. The tension between Galileo and the church were very, very personal. He had promised to not talk about heliocentrism, not at all, because Copernicus wrote about heliocentrism like 100 years earlier.
Right.
And he didn't get in trouble, although he published, on his deathbed or after, I don't remember, but very late in his life. But Galileo, he was actually a friend with Cardinal Barberini, who became the Pope that put him in jail. There's a lot of personal history here. When he published on heliocentrism, the Pope asked him, please do not publish this, as if it was, I guess, certain science, that it was too presumptuous to basically affirm any definitive conclusion about this. Just add this as a disclaimer. And of course, he published when he published in 1662, the dialogue, the famous book that got him arrested.
Yeah.
It was a dialogue between three parties, and one of the party was called Simplicio. And Simplicio was basically a reflection of the Pope. It was someone who was defending Ptolemaic, science and understanding, and he put this disclaimer in his mouth. The Pope completely understood that he was talking about him, or identifying Simplicio, which even in Italian means, the simpleton, the dumb person, and he got arrested a year later.
Sure.
There is, and we also have, information from the ambassador of Tuscany. We know for a fact that the Pope was made aware of the insult in the book.
Yeah. Sure.
There's way more to the story.
I can be guilty, I guess, of something that I think actually, our listeners today
1632, sorry.
Yeah, our listeners today would fully agree, like, that's wrong. Like, you shouldn't kill anyone for saying something.
Oh, he was not killed. He was just in house arrest.
Right, but then eventually...
Well, he died in house arrest, but he had a good life in house arrest.
Okay, so he was in house arrest.
He was not in a dungeon. I cannot believe I'm defending Inquisition right now, but I'm just saying.
You're defending. You're adding good color to the fact that Galileo was doing something. He was very much being a provocateur.
He's definitely
and
very big
ego.
Ego.
That and what I read this weekend from John Henry, but the it's still wrong. It's absolutely wrong to put someone on house arrest for saying something.
Yeah, but it just shows the corruption, the misuse of a religious institution. It doesn't show that the institution is against the progress of science. So that's a different case.
But I think
It just means that someone got insulted and used his position of power in the church to jail someone because of an insult.
But that is just the point needs clarifying. That is an offense against the progress of science when a scientist is put on house arrest for putting out a discovery, even putting it in the mouth of of the Pope, which was a big deal. The culture and the context was different.
Yes, but
that's still going to scare other scientists and make them be much more wary.
It actually scared Descartes, who postponed the publication of his book
like
by 10 years.
Yeah,
right?
How interesting.
So what I'm saying is, like, yes, you're talking about it in the minute, and it's important to understand the context, but it would be unfair to say that the church wasn't making it very difficult to move into a new scientific
Another piece of context that's
world.
important that we tend to forget is that this was in the middle of the 30 Years' War. Like this was very, very. There was a religious war between Protestantism and Catholics at the time, and so the Counter Reformation was very strong, and so Inquisition was unusually alert, against any attack against the church. So, anyways, for sure, a lot of corruption. I agree. I just don't think it's a good example of science versus faith, or the church being against science. There probably are better examples. This is not like the burning of astronomers. What's his name? The guy who almost invented the multiverse.
Let me put it. Then let me put it in an analogy that will make a lot of sense. If you're riding a bike on the road and a 18-wheeler accidentally hits this person on the bike and kills them, there's gonna and people hear about it. There's gonna be a lot less people riding the bike down the road because they're gonna be like, well, someone got hit by an 18-wheeler on that road and they died.
Yeah.
So again, it could be an accident. It could be this was just kind of a miscarriage of justice. It wasn't exactly, the context was different. It still changes things broadly for the other people around the event.
Yeah.
Descartes being
Descartes.
But
a good example would be
an example of that.
I think we're here to. Us three are here, and for this podcast is to try to actually provide some nuance as to why these things happen, rather than to paint them in broad strokes and say something like science and the church are mutually exclusive, or science and faith are mutually exclusive.
Right.
So I think what we're doing here is actually what we want to do, which is try to provide some color.
There was actually a comment in the comment section, and please like, share, and subscribe, and comment. There was a very interesting comment that exactly was referring to this. What I told this commenter is basically that if you want to reject Christianity, I just want to give you better reasons, because we want to discuss truth. And one good example of corruption of the religious institution or Christianity, hijacking of Christianity against science, would be the burning of Giordano Bruno for heresy, because he had very exotic ideas about the world and the universe and about astronomy. So that would be a good example. I just think Galileo is always wielded, is a good word,
for sure,
wielded as an example, probably by the likes of deGrasse Tyson. I would not be surprised.
I mean, I could tell you it is for sure by him. Sure. I've seen that episode of Cosmos,
and this guy, this guy, he takes a lot of example from a book that was very, very, very seminal in the mid 19th century by Andrew Dickson White, which was really the book that pop culturized really the opposition between science and faith. I have it somewhere. I can show it to you later. But
that's
anyways,
great.
So all that to say, we're providing color to this topic.
Yeah.
So before we proceed, I just want to tackle one subtopic that is extremely important to define what science is. And the reason is that this is not an article. It's chapter 10, I believe, right, of the Oxford Companion to, let me find the actual title.
I think it was chapter 5.
Chapter 5? Yeah. Okay. Written by John Henry, professor at, I think, in Edinburgh, I think. In any case, in this chapter, starts with, I guess, the mentioning of the historical background of the scientific revolution that you can date between the 1500s and the 1700s, roughly. But it really argues for the fact that things happened not in a vacuum. It's not an actual revolution, but it's a progress from times before. And so, as an example, until Voltaire, Diderot, and I don't remember if it was which philosopher, Anglo-Saxon philosopher, really popularized the term of the Dark Ages as a derogatory term. In any case, whatever happened before the scientific revolution as being obscurantist and occult and dogmatic, it is not really the case, according to the chapter that we read. Does anyone want to comment on this?
I actually do. I think it's funny because a big part of the scientific revolution was that there were people with enough money to bring in these guys and support their work, which means this dark age, I don't know really what, maybe they were stuck in like Aristotelian philosophy, but there were some people making a lot of money. So there was commerce happening, there was advancement, there was technological advancement for sure. And there was a framework that was created socially and governmentally.
There was the end of feudalism.
Yeah.
The start of capitalism.
And a lot of this was done by the church. the church actually was this like cohesive, this thing that actually brought a lot of cohesion to Europe. Obviously, there's the Reformation that happened, but largely there was this unification of thought. The royals were all brought together underneath the umbrella of the church, and there was a lot more talk, a lot more discussion. Trade routes were open. They were building roads. They were getting stuff around, and so like that was one of the backshots. I almost thought it was this might be insane to say, but
say it.
I'm gonna say it. I actually feel like there is something. There needs to be minimally a footnote for the different people, the patrons of these different scientists,
like
Newton,
the financial backers.
Yeah, like Newton discovered this. Like Newton wouldn't have been able to eat
right.
without this guy who saw the brilliance of a person like that.
It's case by case, but some are just rich, like for example, Francis Bacon was a politician. Yeah. John Locke was a doctor. He was a medical doctor. Yeah. So you have different profiles with people who just have money already, right?
And I think that's good. But I think my point actually remains the same. I was like, as these guys are making these like really groundbreaking discoveries and they're remembered in the history books, the backdrop for them being able to even do this stuff was because there was at the time, smart enough guy to amass enough wealth to fund this endeavor. So I would say in some sort of really tactile way, equally as intelligent partnership of a guy going, this needs to happen. You have good ideas. I'm recognizing what you're saying as this can be valuable. And they, from what I understand, got very little in the way of material, they didn't get anything back from this.
Compensation.
No compensation for this.
Right.
They just were like, this needs to happen because I believe in this.
Yeah.
Like, God bless those guys.
And just so we are all aligned, this is the taken from Oxford Illustrated History of Science, the book of History of Science, and it is the chapter number 5 by John Henry.
That's what we're referencing a little bit throughout the episode.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of guiding this discussion.
Yeah.
So that would be my comment on what you said. Essentially, the Dark Ages weren't so dark. And I almost wish we could like eliminate that terminology about it, because the Dark Ages...
It should be Middle Ages.
There's some of the coolest stuff to ever happen on our planet happened during that time. And we all harken back to those moments. And the stories and the nights and the culture, I mean, they're still some of the most powerful imagery and like elicit the strongest emotional connection in Western culture. Like when you make a reference back to something, swords, armor, knights, dragons, maidens, castles.
Right.
That stuff's cool.
So one thing we want to convey in this episode is there was no Dark Ages. Arguably, there was a lot of progress, scientific progress, philosophical progress, societal progress. I mean, the end of the feudal system. Even the king of France, of the Franks, Clovis, the first or the second, who married a slave, his slave. So there's a lot of positive evolution and progress during the Middle Ages. So let's call them the Middle Ages, not the Dark Ages. That's a good start.
All right.
But the second thing I want to talk about is what is science. This is really important to agree on why Francis Bacon's scientific method was so revolutionary. And it is because one of the reasons is that the heritage that we had, the scientific heritage, was mostly Aristotelian. And so we want to define science, and science is not merely technology. Technology the Romans had, the Greeks had technology, the Chinese, the Arabs. All civilizations have some kind of technology and are able to build pyramids, right? Mm-hmm. And we always often wonder about how the pyramids were built, how did they know the science, etc., right? But if you go to Cairo, you have the pyramids of Giza. You have way more pyramids than the 3 that you see there.
Sure.
But the second site, the most important site, would be Saqqara, which is, I think, 30 miles south of Cairo. And what you see there is pretty impressive, because these are drafts of these are drafts of the pyramids of Giza, basically. Mm-hmm. And you see pyramids that have a very flat angle. You see pyramids with steps. It's like they tried a few things until empirically they were able to determine this is the angle we're going to use, right? This is not science. This is technology.
Okay.
Science is observation and experiments, etc., combined with the theorizing of what you just observed. Once you theorize, you're able to predict to express prediction and prohibition about events that you might encounter later. So, for example, if you're able to measure how far the stone I'm throwing is going to get with the amount of force I'm putting, with a good scientific theory, you should be able to, without throwing it with a stronger force, predict where it's going to land if I increase the force, double it, right? This is science. And we did not have science until the scientific revolution. This is why this period, the 1500s to the 1700s, is so special, is because for the first time, and I think it started, I would say, with Copernicus, because Copernicus was probably the first to use mathematically so heavily to build his case, which was completely wrong. Like his whole book, which was published, I think, in 1543, is completely wrong because everything is using circular, orbits. But what is important is that he put the sun at the center. It's a heliocentric model, and he used mathematics, right? Mm-hmm. So that's really important to say what science is versus technology.
Yeah. And I think too, another thing, like I think we have an interesting understanding of sciences as well, because we think of it like as this discrete discipline, like science. Science is a particular discipline, but I think maybe what you're getting at is science is more of like a methodology. It's a way of coming to know things, which would be the German understanding of science. So like the Germans and the German school and like the English school, the American school use science differently. Typically, we think of science as a discipline, and science would be, from the German side of things, like a way of coming to
Wissenschaft.
Yeah, Wissenschaft, yeah.
Wissenschaft.
Or wissenschaftlich, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's different, and I think that's important for like our listeners to understand is there is a discipline that we call like science, and that works itself out in like biology and chemistry and physics, and those are sciences. But what we actually mean is that science is a way of coming to know the world and reckon with that knowledge to move forward, and that appeared in the history of human culture at a particular time. And it didn't exist like that before.
Yes.
So that distinction between science and technology is a really good one. The ancient cultures were very, very intelligent. Highly intelligent. They did amazing things like the pyramids.
Yeah.
But they did not have what we call science.
So now,
which emerged.
Yeah, and this brings us to the second point.
Right.
Why do you guys think scientific revolution really took place in modern Europe, or in Europe in this time, and not elsewhere, and not another time? Based on the chapter that we read from Professor John Henry, Professor Emeritus at the University of Edinburgh, who wrote this chapter in the Oxford Companion or Handbook to History of Science.
I would actually just go back to reference what I just said about the Middle Ages, is that there was a really strong economic and governmental backdrop for this stuff to happen in Europe. They had
money?
Yeah, there was money, there was relative peace, there was good structure for moving around.
Actually, I have a lot of objections to what you just said.
Well, it's relative.
Because the peace, for example, the 30 Years' War is like...
It's still relative peace compared to Africa or Asia.
It's 15% of Germany's population just killed.
I know, it sounds crazy, but I was looking at just before we started, an article from, I can't remember his name, it might be Roger, but geographer Roger Diamond, who has a book, Gun, Germs, and Steel. This
is Diamond.
Diamond. Yeah. And talking, I mean, it really reduced his idea, though, down to there was an East-West movement, which that happened in Europe more than North-South. So ecologically, you had the same stuff growing all the way across these cultures. So they could trade stuff that had they understood what it was, they knew how to use it. The same kind of wood, the same kind of crops, the same kind of minerals. It was all the same stuff.
He's a geographer. Mm-hmm. I didn't feel that.
It's just what it said on Google. But but the north south aspect of somewhere like Africa, like it explains why it didn't develop trade like that. And I think that backdrop,
environmental conditions.
Yeah, those conditions really created a great backdrop for guys like this with minds like this to sit and ponder these things. Because they were able to find patrons that were able to house them, and they, obviously had...
Yeah, he's a professor of geography at UCLA.
Yeah. And again, I would even go back a step further and say, I can just see, and this is real conjecture, but it makes sense to me from just some of the people I know in my life today that I know lots of great people that have done great things with their life, doctors and physicists and but then also guys that have done incredible business, have made lots of money.
Sure.
And I can see the intelligence and the spark in each one of these people. And I think one of the things that has driven some of the guys, let's say like some of the modern guys I know that have big businesses, that would be the potential patrons of guys like this, like Galileo and the likes in the scientific revolution. I can see them looking at a system like the Aristotelian system and going, yeah, I don't get it. Let's just make some money. And just like that personality trait, that drive, I'm just going like, let's just make some money. Let's do something different. I don't really understand that, but it doesn't really matter because this is what matters. And it's a shift of focus. And those guys existed in that world in Europe at that time, that there was a way for them to make a lot of money. And that set up a big backdrop for how
But it was
advancement
only
came
true.
around.
It was only true if it was actually practical. Like I don't think they were interested. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it would be true only if it was practical. So, for example, if you were able to support Newton, you would do it because in result you would get a lot of benefits, like whether more accuracy and precision in the measurement of the movements of planets that would lead you to better navigation, or whatever.
What I'm saying is the precursor to that. So it's like what comes just before this meteoric rise in technology is affluence. And I think you could argue the same for America. Like in the United States, we see this massive technological boom.
Okay, so the counter factual to this would say that what do you make of all the civilizations that were very wealthy and never developed science? Like China is a good example. The Arabs.
Well, I mean, China, sure, yeah, to some extent, they've never been as they've never had as much wealth geographically as like Europe has. Their available cropland is way less productive than Western.
But forget about this for a
Western or northern.
second. Just think about the emperor having a lot of gold and thinking, I don't know what to do with the money. I really love this guy. I want to understand this guy. Let's pay this guy.
Well, they're also fighting a lot. Like their greatest. China.
They brought Italian astronomers because they were not. They were observing a lot, but they were very dogmatic also and understanding things from the perspective of Asian religion and Asian spirituality.
I see your angle here. And
So it was basically still astrology.
No, I see your angle, and I think you're right here.
So throwing money at this
There
would
was,
not have
I
led
think
anywhere.
I think there's no getting away from the fact, even economic drivers, there's no getting away from the fact that all of those things come around from people thinking the right things and holding the right beliefs collectively.
Yes.
And I think they even bring this. Oh, they almost go. John Henry almost goes this far in the beginning of chapter 5. Yeah. Why didn't these cultures who had great technological advances, why did they not do science?
Right.
And then he kind of leaves it there, but then he ends the chapter pretty, talking a lot about the effects of Christianity and the fact that. Well, actually, he actually begins this way too, talking about how Christianity essentially was the right belief system for science to arrive in the world in this way.
So what do you think, Taylor? What in the Christian faith could have helped in the rise of modern science?
But can I make an addendum too?
Yep.
I think it's also Christianity creates the right conditions for wealth as well in an area like this. So like that wealth boom that supported the science boom was supported by shared belief in Christianity in the region. Despite 30 Years' War, they had disagreements, but they were theological disagreements about a God that, by and large, they were all trying to serve. So it was still, they had the backdrop of Christian belief and to set this economic boom in as well, which, economic booms don't last with dishonesty. That's like baseline. That's one that just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So you can see how that would be a great product of Christian belief because of how, it's prioritizing honesty so much.
Mm-hmm. And
that's just one example.
Yeah. No, it is true. I always love to speak with Arabs and Middle Eastern about their societies and what they think might be hindering some things. Whether the army or engineering or the general development of the country. And a couple of times the feedback was that they appreciate in America, in the West in general, the emphasis put on the idea of truth and transparency. And not because they love the truth, it's not like they love Jesus or something, but they just see that things get done when we just are really honest about a failure, for example, and a big hindrance in the Arab world, and because of Islam mostly, I would say, would be the idea of shame. And honestly, most of the world is still, apart from the West, stuck in a honor-shame, prism. And therefore, admitting fault, guilt, or whatever in the Arab world is very difficult. And imagine you're an engineering firm and you make a big mistake. Like, it's just made more difficult for you to just signal that you made a mistake.
You get a sense of despair when you fail. You have this shame.
You have the shame.
Hopelessness comes. The despair.
That's the first part. The second part, I would say that there's a lot of what Arabs call wasta. And wasta is basically all the connections, and you typically promote people with a certain family name, with a certain status already, not the best people. And this is something that happens sometimes in the West, but overwhelmingly everywhere I worked, the best people got promoted and the worst got fired. And that's not, it's something that
I think there's also something to be said.
That is more rare than we might think. And that really influences how you do technology and science.
And I would say even a layer deeper is kind of this universal empathy that's promoted by Christianity, where when asked what the greatest commandment is, Jesus says the classic Jewish line of love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. Yeah, and so the Pharisees were like, he's got it. And then he goes, and they're like, what do you mean and? Like that's what we're asking for. He goes, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then they go into this debate about who's your neighbor.
On these two things.
All the law and the prophets. So, but that's just like a universal empathy thing, and it started working its way through, permeating this culture, to where women got elevated, children got elevated, family got elevated, community got elevated.
The foreigner as well.
The foreigner got elevated.
All right, so I got a few things that I want to say, I think, that are related to this. Your question as to, what did theology contribute to the scientific revolution that allowed it to flourish? And I think these are on the table, right? Maybe like that universal empathy, or even the fact that they were sort of all unified under the church and things like that. But from an actual theological point of view, those things are theological as well. But I think the idea of there is an objective world, an objective reality, and that objective reality can be known, is a very fundamentally Christian ideal.
Yes.
And that's also, I think, like scholars like T.F. Torrance, who I've mentioned on the podcast before, would go back to the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So the idea that the divine and the thing that brings that which God that which brings intelligibility to the universe became a person and unified that intelligibility with humanity, which happens in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, was actually a fundamental driver, even way beyond the Middle Ages, in the first centuries of the church, for the idea that something is out there that we can know, that can be known by us, and that we can use our minds to pursue that thing to a good end. And so all of those things, I think, came to the fore in the Middle Ages. And then with the rise of the explanatory power of the sciences, there also arose, like, say, within British empiricism, a pretty robust skepticism of these initial ideas. So the ideas of Christian faith, which were, there is a reality out there supplied by God that can be known by me. I think that's a baseline assumption for most of the earliest thinkers that moved in the ways of science. But then that assumption, it's interesting because that's a theological assumption about the world. That assumption actually came under fire pretty quickly with David Hume and the skeptics.
Yep, that's
right,
true.
And the British empiricists.
You're right to say that it came very soon. You're right.
And so, and I think that's actually, so if we're asking about like how did we get to where we are today, it's not that science arose and disproved God or something like that, but it's that the theological suppositions that allowed science to thrive, those were suppositions about the nature of the universe and how it exists independently of a knowing mind that's endowed for understanding and intelligibility, how that reality came under fire.
Yeah.
What you're saying there was so interesting. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get right back with Hume.
All right.
All right, you were saying about Hume.
Well, what I was saying is that the scientific revolution was grounded on theological suppositions. The idea that there is a world outside of us.
Yes,
that world
and just to
can
be
known.
clear, scientific revolution would be between the 1500 and 1700,
That's
and
right.
David Hume is the mid 1700s.
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Yeah. So he's
Right
I think
after.
he's publishing almost right in the middle of the 1700s, right? 1740s.
Yeah.
Something like that. And so because Christians assumed that God was the creator, that he created things that exist in space and in time, and that humans can know those things because we bear the image of God and have the capacities for knowledge that God has, right? So these sort of underlying theological suppositions rested at the base of a lot of the early scientific revolution.
So I want to go a little bit deeper on this particular point.
Okay.
Where is this presupposition coming from? If you just look at the Bible and the Christian God,
Mm-hmm.
where would you find this? Of course, we're created in His image, so that's a good start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Imago Dei.
But what else could you use to justify the world is intelligible? It's a match for us, creature.
Well, I mean, Christians have always assumed that God is the creator of the universe.
Yes, but Muslims as well.
Sure.
And other religions as well.
Yeah. So in fact, that supposition can be shared by Muslims and Jews
Right.
and things like that, right?
Yeah.
God is the creator.
Yep.
But if God is the creator, that there has to be something, a noun called creation. That means that there are objects of intelligibility that exist outside of our experience of them. Like the world exists regardless of my experience of it. If I sit in a Plato's
So
cave,
by just non-questioning reality, you already have a good. Well, actually, you're right.
not about non-questioning reality, but Plato's cave essentially suggests that reality doesn't exist apart
Yeah.
from my perception
True.
of it.
True.
Theology says creation exists apart from my perception of it.
Right. That is true.
I can sit in a cave my whole life, in Plato's cave my whole life, and the world still exists, and God still exists, and everything is as God created
Okay.
it.
So
right?
how would you compare this with Islam, for example? Let's assume that Muslims are supposed to consider the Torah as being revelation,
Yeah.
although they think it's corrupted. But let's assume they do include it. What would be the difference between Christians and Muslims?
Well, I'm not suggesting at this point in the narrative that there is a radical difference.
Okay.
So-
There is one that is very important.
Okay, that you say it then. Yeah.
It's the fact that for Muslims, for Islam, it is blasphemous to
Blasphemy.
bind or consider that God might have created laws by which he has to work,
That he has to obey.
obey.
Okay.
Right? It's blasphemous. Therefore, they are categorized as occasionalists, which is basically a God that is more unpredictable,
Okay.
Less consistent, and I won't say capricious necessarily, but something like that, where he could play with the laws of nature at any time, any point, right?
At any occasion.
Yeah,
Which is where the term occasionalist would come from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is really huge if you think about it.
Yeah.
Like to think like there cannot be any laws by which God might have used to create the world because otherwise it would be
He would be
blasphemous.
limited in that sense.
He would be
God's
limited.
self would be limited.
Yeah,
Right,
that's
okay.
a big hindrance.
Okay, good. No, that's
Yeah.
very important. That's a very important distinction between Islam and say Christianity, which might, as we talked about at the very beginning, lend to the idea that the scientific revolution didn't happen in the Middle East; it happened in
Yep.
the West.
Yep.
Okay, good. Good connection. The other particularly theological connection I would make is the incarnation of Jesus Christ, because with the incarnation of Jesus Christ, the divine, transcendent being, God, outside of space and time, was unified with space and time, right? Became a human being that you could touch and not taste. You could touch and you could see and you could experience and you could know. And that lent a concrete assumption to the idea that something apart from me can be knowable because God has made himself known in the person of Jesus Christ.
Now I have
right?
a similar corollary.
Okay.
What do you make of the Greek gods that also are transcendent in the sense that they step into our world to do all sorts of things?
Sure, but
very different things.
Sure,
Yeah, mostly have sex with humans.
rape,
No rape.
pillage, plunder.
Huh. Interesting distinction, but needed.
So let's make that distinction first.
All right.
Classic. The second distinction is that the Greek conception of creation is always that creation is degradation, right? It's what I mean by that is, like, if Plato viewed the forms as true reality, then material reality was actually a downgrade from that. Would you agree?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. For Plato,
so,
for sure.
Yeah, so Plato would say material reality is a downgrade from that. So the divine, the forms, those are non-material. That's where reality's essence lies, and then the created world, the material world, is a downgrade. Christianity says the opposite, basically, or not the opposite, but it makes a case in the opposite direction. When God made creation, God said that this isn't good. It is endowed.
He's good and very good.
Good and very good when
yeah.
it came to humanity in particular, but endowed with something called goodness.
Yeah. And if it ever got bad, it is redeemed as well.
That's right. So, and Christian theology has built-ins for things like bad. It's called the doctrine of sin, if anyone's heard of it. So essentially, Christian theology says creation is good. Greek philosophy says creation is not good, or material.
And the eschatology is
Plato
towards a
did.
new creation as well.
Right.
So-
That's right.
Plato did, but then Aristotle made an
Yeah.
important distinction that you can't have forms without like a substance.
Without substance.
Yeah.
So and it's funny because he was a student of Plato, and I think that's probably, you can see where he departed from Plato's dogma. And
But
was
but also this is where John Henry comes in, because whose philosophy actually undergirded the Middle Ages? Aristotle's.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to also make a reference to Raphael's painting, where you see Plato and Aristotle in the School of Athens, and you see Plato pointing to the sky and Aristotle to the ground, which affirms exactly what you just said, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So because you were talking about the Middle Ages and Aristotle, we have to also consider that Augustine was very heavily influenced by Neoplatonism. So you had a lot of Neoplatonism until you had people like Aquinas, and really. Aquinas, which is like 13th century.
And
this is where really the church, which was Ptolemaic still the whole time. So Ptolemaic means it's still geocentric, very strongly.
Yep.
But it became heavily Aristotelian during the scholastics.
Yeah.
So
Not
what I
before.
was making was a callback to earlier discussion about the fact that the revolution wasn't so much like this burst onto the scene. It was a progression.
Yeah.
And that you see a progression that, and it's funny, you actually see the
even
speed,
within Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, you
There's
see
a
the
slight
well, I mean,
progression.
you actually see the progression really clearly, and that's, I think, the foundation of most philosophy 101s is like from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, and that's why they're kind of taught in a unit. And but then you have this repetition, not repetition, but you have like the revolutions of this great wheel of human thinking begin to speed up. So you have Aristotle, this one big movement that lasted all through the Middle Ages, and then you see it roll over into a new, like an even deeper understanding, and now it's rolling over into a deeper understanding, and now it's affecting technology. But that's what I was doing a callback to. I wasn't making a distinction about that.
He was,
But I was calling it back further, going, you can even see that the revolution isn't even maybe the right word. It was just a progression.
So the point being, Plato had a conception of the material that did not share with Christian conceptions of the material world. That was the point that I was making.
Plato did not.
Plato had a difference in his understanding of the material world and its inherent goodness and what it represented
compared
than Christians.
Again, it depends when.
Plato himself with the forms. And
I mean, it was pretty. It influenced Christianity a lot until Aquinas.
It did, but one of the reasons Plato influenced Christianity the most is because Plato endorsed the idea of transcendent being and divinity,
right, and souls,
right. Yeah. But the point that I was making about the incarnation itself and the extrinsic intelligibility of the universe was that the incarnation united the divine with the created.
Yeah.
And because God gives himself to be known in Jesus Christ, it is indicated that creation can be known
Yes.
in and of itself.
Yes.
So that was the Christian distinction that I think a few minutes ago you were asking me to make in Christian theology. So you gave the distinction between Islam and
Greek gods, pantheon.
Yeah, and my distinction was
Yeah.
the doctrine of the incarnation.
But I think we should add something that also ties back to Islam, is that the Greek pantheon is made of gods that are not only immoral, but they're also they're not constant, they're inconsistent, and therefore you cannot deduce from their behavior any patterns that would guide you towards regularity,
Intelligibility.
patterns, intelligibility.
Yeah.
So I
That's a good-
just
that's a
want to
great- that's a
use
good
this
point.
episode to really stress how much ideas influence our behavior and how we do science, really how we think. If we don't believe there are laws that are ready for us to be discovered, we will not try to discover them, and we will not end up with a society where we have Descartes and Galileo and Newton.
So this is a great segue into the next moment of the scientific revolution, was that when theology provided a coherent basis for the scientific revolution, theological claims, things that we've been discussing for the last 10 minutes, when they provided a coherent basis for the scientific revolution, the idea that humans are endowed with the capacity for knowledge and that creation is something that exists independently and objectively of us that we can know, that claim came under fire very, very quickly. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
Yeah.
with Hume
Yeah.
in the mid 1700s.
Yeah.
So about 50 years after the so-called scientific revolution.
So we're in this place now where we see this gulf, if you will, between science, the ways of coming to know the natural world, and theology, the way of knowing God. We see this massive gulf in between those things. And what I would like to suggest very simply is that theology provided the basis for the scientific revolution. And then those theological suppositions came under fire very quickly in the midst of the scientific revolution. And that is what's created the discrepancy between science and faith now. Not the revolution itself, but the movement of British empiricism, David Hume, Immanuel Kant within that revolution that actually contributed to that. So I think if we were looking for a place like genealogically where we could pin it, the divide, I think we could pin it there. And so we could talk about Hume and his philosophies if
I just wanted to read a quote from Alfred North Whitehead, who is not known to be a Christian at all. And so in 1925, he gave a series of lectures at Harvard. He's a philosopher and mathematician, he was. And he explained that science developed in Europe because of the widespread faith in the possibility of science that derived from medieval theology. So in one sentence, first of all, he remarked that the Christian faith was responsible for the basis, as you said, for the scientific revolution. But the second thing, he also redeemed scholasticism that was completely downplayed by Diderot, Voltaire, where they called the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, right? So I'll put the reference to this because it's really worth noting. And this was like at the beginning of the 20th century.
Right.
So it was already when you have the naturalism that was there. It's a non-Christian. It's the time, he co-authored, the Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell.
And that's probably when those disciplines were the furthest apart at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's saying not actually.
Yep, exactly.
And he's a non-Christian.
He is a non-Christian.
So, yeah, that's
anyways,
interesting.
So you want to go with Hume now?
Well, I just wanted to talk
Deeper.
about Hume because I think
let's go.
allowing anyone listening, if they know a lot about Hume or don't know a lot about Hume, it just allows us to see how we've gotten to where we are more clearly. This is a sort of a method of discourse called, genealogy, right? Tracing the history of thought from a person to a person or a movement to a movement. So just to put a name on it. But David Hume essentially looked at the pure and unfettered reason, this capacity for knowledge that had arrived on the scene from theological suppositions in the generations immediately preceding him. And so those people were saying things like, I am a human, I have this capacity for reason. This capacity for reason can be applied to the material world. I can come to real knowledge of that world, physics, astronomy, things like that, mathematics, biology, anatomy, and physiology. And so we have this place where, man, we can really do a lot to come to know the world. And Hume basically said, nope. Because we perceive things as cause and effect. We perceive, like, I think the analogy that I like to use, I can't remember if Hume uses, I don't think he does, but it's the analogy of a pool table, which is we see a pool ball traveling in a trajectory, hitting a pool ball, and that pool ball going off in another direction. And rationality, or the rise of the human sciences, would allow us to make inferences on the nature of the pool ball and trajectory and mathematics and things like that, and to say, if this pool ball is traveling at this speed and this velocity and it hits it at this angle, that pool ball is 1,000 times out of 1,000 going to go in this direction. And Hume would actually say, we don't know that. That's actually not human knowledge. Mm-hmm. That's not what knowledge is. We make inferences off of things that we see, and we assume that those inferences are based on laws that are immutable and eternal and things like that. And he would say that's not true at all. The only things we can know are the things we experience, right? We know our experiences of things, but we don't know that there's underlying, like I said, physical properties or immutable laws that make those things happen. We just see them happen over and over.
I think the problem that he had, and by the way, this example is in the treatise concerning of human nature.
Of human understanding? Is it human nature or
human nature in 1740, and the inquiry concerning human understanding in 1748.
Right.
So in both, he uses this example.
Right.
And what is interesting...
he used the example of the pool table?
Yeah.
Okay, I couldn't remember if he
it
actually
sounded familiar to me, too. I
couldn't remember if he used it or if someone else did.
I remember also reading it, but I wasn't sure it was him.
I just wasn't sure pool is that old. Apparently it's old, man.
I kind of had the same thought.
Pool is...
Billiards.
I didn't think of that at all. I was just thinking about what you said, the causality. It's interesting because if it's a bit of the... I don't know if you know the Zeno paradoxes.
No.
So... we have to talk more about this when we were going to talk about space.
Great, I'd love to. Yeah.
Essentially, it's during the ancient Greece, you had this philosopher that came up with paradoxes. He came up with these paradoxes where it's about the divisibility of a distance in infinite segments.
Oh, sure.
And whether you can arrive at your destination
right.
if it's actually divisible by infinity, right?
Right.
And it's kind of the same, I think, that Hume is using when he talks about the pool table. At which point do I actually touch the ball that actually,
That's right. That's right.
Is there an infinity of empty space, and what is actually responsible for moving the ball? Am I really responsible, or something else?
Yeah.
So I think he's confused about infinity.
Yeah. And what is responsible for movement is something we can't know.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
what he would say.
Yeah.
And so that creates a very real skepticism about the human faculty of knowledge.
It's really destructive.
Yeah,
it's really destructive.
Yeah, really.
Like imagine you teach a kid, you know what? The things you do actually don't impact what you have around you. It's incidental. You will never know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
Imagine growing up like this.
Well, and so the implications on theology are monumental in subsequent and directly subsequent thinkers like Immanuel Kant, who read Hume's work and said the quote, which is famous, which is that Hume has awakened me from my dogmatic slumber, and Hume's critique of the human capacity for knowledge and the objective intelligibility of the world was a through line to Kant's very formal distinction between our experience of things and things in themselves, and how our experience of the phenomenal world and the reality of the noumenal world are things that don't ever touch, right? And so then God became a concept where in Jesus Christ, God was a concept, the divine was married so identically with creation that in the person of Jesus Christ, we could know God. With these thinkers, that supposition is removed from possibility. Mm-hmm. And if we can't know God, and everything we can know is derived from godless faculties and or skepticism and or just pure experience, for Kant it was the transcendental aesthetic that he created, the a priori capacities of mind, right, that are built in.
So for Kant, God's existence was a necessary result of his philosophy rather than something you can experience.
And if I can interject,
yeah,
these are very clear departures from, because Kant, I think, claimed to be a Christian.
Sure,
right?
Yeah,
and,
yeah. He postulated, yeah.
He had a Lutheran upbringing,
right? Yeah. These are super clear departures from Christian thought. So to accept these is to reject what God says about himself within Scripture. Like Acts 17 says, in him we live and move and have our being.
Right.
So you're flatly rejecting that when you accept these premises, which is like, which you might go, well, that's kind of just really biblical. Like you're kind of being too theological. It's like, no, that's fabric of reality.
Yeah.
That's a really strong assertion about the fabric of our existence.
Now, I take that for what you say as and I would endorse that. I think that's exactly true. The thing that happened after that was that instead of the church fighting for that position as it existed,
and they should have,
they capitulated. The church theology capitulated.
When you say the church, you mean theologians?
I do, but I also mean those
they made concessions.
Those believers whom those theologians affected, and Lutheran theology in particular, because this happened in the German school in a way that I think is traceable, like very clearly traceable. So when I say Christianity, I do mean theologians, but I mean
right. But when you say capitulated, because let's assume you have the German church, right, that existed. You had the Anglican church, so you have churches that are I guess has some kind of oversight. How can you not capitulate when you see all of your students, the future theologian, the future Anglican priests that are becoming deists, and you still have to hire them because you need pastors or you need priests? How would you not capitulate? How can you oppose this change of a whole generation?
And I'm not suggesting it's very easy, although I will say it's easy in a sense. Well, some of them didn't make these crazy claims until they already had posts, for instance. Like posts like in the academy. Like they were making these claims from within. I see. Only very few of these figures, and I would even
so they were undercover basically.
Well, only very few of these figures were people operating outside of the church. They were operating within the church. Right. So it wasn't like the church was having to determine whether or not they were going to hire these fringe thinkers.
So in essence, they should have been more honest, and if they think differently than institution, they should have resigned and just started writing philosophy.
I don't know. Maybe.
Was it clear to them? Was it clear to them, given because there was, this is during a period where access to the text of the Bible was limited.
It wasn't
not
that
anymore.
for that.
Not
right. No, but I'm saying it's still limited.
Not in the sense that we have it today.
Not in the sense we have it today. You would expect them to be studying this and using this as a source of learning. I'm just trying to give them some sort of way out of going like maybe they didn't understand how much this came to bear on how they understood God.
I think you're right. That's what I think the issue is. Now
they're going to play around with it.
Hindsight is 20/20, and that's fair enough, right? Like I'm not saying that Schleiermacher or any of these people were sort of devils in disguise and they were intentionally leading the church astray. I think that they were trying to deal as faithfully as they could with what was happening around them. I just think that potentially, if I might say, in my position of a 21st century Christian looking at 18th century Christians or 19th century Christians, was that I don't think they were as rigorous enough at sticking to orthodoxy, especially the doctrine of incarnation, I think. Like, if I could boil it down, and I think other thinkers would agree with me. I'm not making this up from my own mind, or like other thinkers, T.F. Torrance is someone I reference frequently, but they would say something like the incarnation and a faithful understanding of that when you look at early church fathers like Athanasius on the incarnation, his text on the incarnation, and really understanding that the way they understood it. If we could have been more rigorous in those moments of doubt at returning to those texts and understanding them more clearly, then we might have fended off the attacks a bit more effectively, rather than like how I see it, I could be argued with, but as like someone like Schleiermacher, who from within the church concedes too much ground to a thinker like Kant and says, fine, God is not an object of experience. We talked about this in episode 2, right? God is not an object of experience, but he still has really, really deep and really, really faithful theological convictions and really thinks Christianity is something that is true and meaningful to the world. But he organizes theology as something not as an analysis of our experience of God and the knowledge of God, but rather it becomes an analysis of our experience of faith, or a feeling of the divine, or intuition, or revelation, as something that is sort of happens to us in an intuitive sense, rather than something that happens to us in an objective sense. I would say that at least 1/3 of the concept of revelation is something that happens outside of you, regardless of your experience of it. It's public, right? The life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ happened in space and time, regardless of my experience of it or my acceptance of it. So at least a massive aspect of the theological concept of revelation is something that happens apart from you. That's a particular conviction. That particular conviction is something that I think Schleiermacher lost. And he says, well, actually, revelation, that the entirety of that concept, which is a theological concept, is something that happens intuitively and as a matter of feeling rather than as a matter of, say, fact or objectivity. So that's a sort of diagnosis that I would give in the scientific revolution, is that these ideas that came out of really pure and orthodox theological, Christian particularly theological positions, which is that the world is intelligible and we have a capacity for knowing it, through thinkers like David Hume. And you could talk a lot more about the Huxley and the British empiricist school probably than I can, for sure. Yeah. But those attacks, those attacks were very fateful. They were very fateful.
And could I offer as to maybe another ingredient that's even potentially a little less theologically charged, where it actually kind of makes it, because like it's a little more benign, which is that it's something we talked about before, actually, in a different world, of how, like, I think you're the first person to ever really help me understand string theory. And the math of it.
You?
No.
Me?
I mean, I wouldn't say,
no.
Like, I would by no means say, like, oh, I understand it now. But, like, just giving me the words and the vocabulary to kind of get what they're talking about. And the fact that it's incredibly beautiful math that doesn't explain anything real. And I would take that as a concept and say there is so much packed into the philosophy that David Hume had and Schleiermacher and a bunch of the other guys you talked about, that is, there are these complex, beautiful systems of language that mean almost nothing.
They don't amount to much.
They don't amount to nothing, to anything physical. And I would almost discount them from the scientific revolution because of the definition you gave earlier, that they're not testable. You can't test that. That's not necessarily science.
Yeah.
You can test it against other ideas.
Or you have to do like Newton, who in the epilogue of his publication, he basically said, well, I don't know what exactly gravity is, but I know that my laws, they work, and therefore we're gonna accept my results because they're mathematically sound, although we don't know yet what gravity is, and we might never know what gravity is.
Right.
And I think this is what the piece that is missing, I think, in string theory, for example, is to say this is the value of what we've achieved with mathematics. We've had many awards, things that were awarded because of the math that came out of string theory, but we have never had any like major prize in physics. And there's a reason why, is because our universe doesn't look at all like what string theory is describing, and therefore it might be useless. We will discover, but according to the founder, one of the founders, Leonard Susskind, who is a professor at Stanford, he thinks it's just headed in the wrong direction. We have to go back to the blackboard again and start from scratch. It's just wrong right at this point.
And that's what I'm recommending.
And so we just have to have the humility to just say we have been able to go this far, but we have to acknowledge where we don't know what it is, but at least this part is right. This part of we know relativity is right, because we can prove it, we can test it with GPS, for example. But this part, we just don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And that's did you have a point to add?
Well, I was just going to say, this can go back to the history of thought as well, because Thomas Reid, a contemporary of David Hume, developed a school called common sense realism. He actually did exactly what you're asking us to do. He said, no, we need to have a common starting point. Like, there is intelligibility around us. Like, these things are not, the idea that the world is intelligible is not a place we have to get to using our brain. It's the place that philosophy starts from.
And I think
that was common sense realism.
And I think it goes back to the chapter by John Henry and the emphasis he has on practicality. of the discoveries and how even the scholastics and later during the scientific revolution, a lot of schools were built on very practical stuff such as metallurgy, cement, really things that would help build something. And so Hume might be found himself in this category where he is the kind of useless but interesting and, you know, nice to listen to, kind of like a thinker.
He blurs the
line. But we
that-
just know, okay, you're gonna be useless. But it's really interesting.
But no one has known that. That's the problem with the history.
But nobody has acknowledged
that didn't happen,
It's true.
except for people like Thomas Reed, who said, listen, the intelligibility of the universe, that's not an end that we need to work towards in our reasoning. That's the place we start. The universe is intelligible.
The one caveat.
I'm just saying that was what Reed. That was Reed's school. That was common sense realism.
No, I totally agree.
I'm not saying that's a position that I hold or we. But
no, but the corollary I want to make regarding this is that we have certain partial, objections to some philosophers that we know are useless. And a good example would be people like Michel Foucault or Derrida or Deleuze. They're just not really read and studied in France. They're just very famous. They're very famous in the U.S. And they brought us woke mentality and woke philosophy.
Yeah.
So I think
deconstructionalism and stuff.
I think it probably has a wide acceptance, but I think there are pockets, and I would count the Discovery Institute and the design in the intelligent design movement as being opposed to. On the same basis as Thomas Reed, I would say that we have to do science. So that's interesting, but we need the thing that with the causality thing, we need that.
Let's assume stuff.
Yeah,
let's assume certain things. Which is again like you're with what Newton did. Let's assume gravity.
Because
it makes things work.
Yeah, and
we
also
can move forward.
And we can move forward.
Yeah.
That was, and again, I think that actually opened up a new pocket of understanding about this subject and makes it a little more approachable too, for the regular people that watch and try to learn and understand this. I mean, I'm talking about me, of going like there's a really like normal way to approach this, which is like after a David Hume figure gets done with this long soliloquy of like exactly how the world is actually, you don't really know anything, and then at some point someone at the end of what he says has to go, and
Like to what end?
Like, I gotta eat in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
You're like, I'm gonna go eat.
I'm gonna cause my eating to be eaten.
Yeah, I'm gonna go eat, and I'm gonna go home, and I'm gonna sleep, and I'm gonna get up.
I'm gonna assume that food really does my body good.
It's like an intelligible way. It's a king has no clothes kind of scenario where you're like you have been convinced that and turned this thing completely upside down. And also, I discount it, and I would actually stand by this from what I said earlier, that it's not. Sure, you can talk about David Hume in the context of philosophy in this regard, but I would discount him from any scientific revolution.
Sure,
he didn't discover anything revolutionary.
No,
he's not part of it. He's a counter.
He's like the greatest,
Reformation kind of guy.
You know how they say no one builds a statue for a critic? It's like he's the one critic that they're like, we should probably build a statue for him.
Yeah, it's on the Royal Mile in downtown Edinburgh. It's a massive statue, and his toe is polished clean because all the Scots who don't know who he is actually walk by and touch his little toe, and so it's polished.
It's like he's just this huge critic that's like, you don't know anything. Your brain's in the dark always. You've never seen anything or touched anything or done anything.
It's such a shame because he was really a polymath. He studied at the University of Edinburgh. He was 10, 11, or 12. He was really, really young, and he studied, the Greek, Latin, mathematics, philosophy.
Such a shame.
Well, I mean, you can count Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah.
I wish he was a good philosopher.
We're throwing lots of shade. Lots of shade at Dr. Tyson. Hope you're watching, Dr. Tyson.
Like and subscribe.
We love you really, but we love you in the name of Jesus, sort of thing. I
would say when we were on our break a minute ago, I was actually teeing up to say this before we started recording again. Is that I love seeing the background of these big thinkers. Like what were they like? What was their personality like? Because I think that there's such a flavor of their thinking that's wrapped up in who they.
I'm still mad at him and Kant. He's too isolated, and that's why.
Look, this is my assumption. This is an assumption. Look, this is an assumption. Yeah. And first of all, that was what I would say. This assumption about Kant is reasonable. It's not necessarily true, but it's at least reasonable to.
Do you know why he never got married?
I do not want to get into this right now.
Let me make you more mad. The divide between something like a position that Hume would take if you're walking around in the normal world talking to Joe Schmoes, like I do very, very often, there is a deeper motivation behind why they think on certain lines.
Yeah.
And that motivation is generally really, really base. And I navigate it using Christian thought of like, what are these motivations? You know, Jesus teaches about them a lot of like what's motivating people. And I look at David Hume and I go, he just was very unthankful. That's what I feel. I feel like he was just not a super. When I was first introduced to him in college, and then to this day, and hearing about him now, I just go, you know, he was, and especially given the backdrop of how you discuss the givenness of our being, like he was not thankful or maybe not cognizant of the favored position that he held as a person.
Sure.
And I think it unveils a really helpful distinction, which is, you know, the Christian backdrop for Europe and the scientific revolution was there is God. God gave us our nature, and God gave us nature. And they, you know, the chapter John Henry that we read, you know, mentioned that nature was often referred to as the second book that God wrote.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. There's
and you know we
By
might actually say
Bacon
it's
and by Aquinas and Bacon. Yeah.
yeah, we might actually call it the first book, you know, because, you know, the Council of Nicaea came a lot later. But
Later. What do you mean later?
then creation of
then creation,
Earth
okay.
and the cosmos. But I'm saying what I'm saying is that there's this triad of relationship between God and us, and we are in this universe. But the whole point of the Christian thought is that you're not of this. You're not simply of this place. You are from somewhere else. Like your nature is given from outside of this place.
Yeah.
And that's an assumption that's deep within Christian thought. And when you lose sight of that, and I think John Henry even made the distinction that Descartes made sure to make a distinction that the animal world and the natural world was like mechanisms, but humans were distinct from that. They weren't mechanical. There was something else, some other quality to them. We would call probably the soul, because we have mechanical faculties, but
Sure.
they don't make up what we are and our being.
Right.
That distinction, I think, is what he's pointing at, which is there's this God that's real, that's outside, and he created us, and we're actually, our nature is from outside, but it's mixed with this current natural world. And when you lose sight of that, and you say, you know what, actually my given nature from God is less important, it's my more natural, my more, you know, physical nature, you begin to come up with bad conclusions.
Yeah.
I think. And I think that's why so quickly, I think that could even be described, that could be, I mean, you know, to use a scriptural backdrop here, you know, sin is the lust of the eye, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And nothing brings those things about faster than success. You know, like Europe birthed the scientific revolution. They made this incredible advancements. They went all over the world with these ideas, and you know, we're living in it today. And as that happened, it just created this physical, natural ease for this large group of people, and it began to, you discount your spiritual nature, your given nature, because the physical stuff is so easy to get now.
That's
like
right.
This is so much easier.
That's right.
Let's just do this. Let's just focus on this. Let's go get that tasty thing. Let's go get that shiny thing. Let's go, and then let's disagreeing about the tasty stuff and the shiny stuff, and then let's fight wars. And you know,
and if I could put it on a theological moment that it's not in literature or represented in literature, so bear with me. But I think the sin that occurred in the human heart in the middle of all this was that my ability to know the world became my ability.
Yeah.
Right. It became my capacity for knowledge and reason. Rationality was a pure and unfettered aspect of my mind. That's very subtle, and it's not represented in the literature that I know of. Maybe it is. But that's an essentially sinful position. It's idolatry. It's the first sin of pride. It's the exact thing that you're
the
describing. It's the self. Because before that, immediately before, in some context, again, not represented in the literature, the assumption is what I can know is given to me by God. There's an authority structure. It's provided. It's given from without.
Yeah.
The subtle shift was knowledge has become my capacity to wield like a sword. Reason has become my way to split the universe open and to know it. And I think that subtle shift, that theologically sinful moment in the hearts of people, was that which led us astray. So.
That might not be written in the academic literature, but that story that you just told is written in the heart of every academic.
Absolutely.
Every person stepping into a classroom, every person doing the science, every person listening to anyone say anything else. Mm-hmm. There is this, that exists, this me-ness. Yeah. Yeah. Like, it's about me. It's my you shift quickly into just Christian theology, talking about the carnal nature of man.
Right.
But I mean, there's a reason again, going back, referencing the backdrop for the scientific revolution, that is kind of where we were leading the discussion, or is where it's coming from. Like, there was an understanding of that, and that carnal nature was being, at least in some part, held at bay, and then this spiritual nature, the given spiritual nature, I think that given spiritual nature is where the scientific explosion came from, and I think that's represented in the literature because of who wrote the literature.
It's good,
and I think it's a good segue to talk about the future of science, because since the scientific revolution, we had people like Hume, of course, but later on, at the end of the 19th century, we started to experience the rise of naturalism, which was congruent, or which basically happened right after the publication of The Origins of Species, that happened in 1859. And so 2 decades later, or a decade later, you had the defenders of Darwinism, because it really divided philosophy and science, not just religious people versus non-religious, but really scientific and scientists and philosophers. Because we had to redefine what the scientific method is. If you look at the chapter, and when the author John Henry talks about Francis Bacon and the scientific method, there was an attempt really to follow a very precise way to make observation, and then formulate possible ways of explaining the observations, but over time we noted that this method was not necessarily the one that we should follow all the time, every time. It was not just the one size fits all, and as a result, Darwin came with his book, which was a long argument, as how he calls it, with a collection of evidence that covers a wide range, from pigeons to dogs to fossils to plants, orchids, just to build a case that is not a direct demonstration, but it's just something that supports some kind of a almost a feeling that he has that things look like they might be coming out of each other, and therefore there must be something that explains it. And if I look at all these sets of evidence, my science, my new method, which we could call hypothetical deductive, or maybe the inference to the best explanation, which Stephen Meyer always emphasizes this, that he uses Darwin's method to do science today, which is collecting evidence, and then find hypotheses that could explain, right? So anyways, we experience the rise of naturalism. What is the future of science today? Because if we talk about, especially what you mentioned about the carnal nature, pride, isn't it obvious, or shouldn't we experience a downfall of science if really science is a match between our minds and the intelligibility of the world and the objectivity of the world, and we start to devolve into Derrida and Deleuze and Foucault, and things are not what they seem, etc. Where do we land? What is the future of science?
Well, I think you probably have a lot to offer for that question. I could offer some thoughts, and I'm sure you could as well. So how would you like to start?
I'd like to probably
You wrap it up. You can give us some thoughts as
I think you answer your own question, and then we can jump in.
Okay, my impression is that there's a confluence of two movements. There's the secular, just regular mainstream science that is realizing more and more that you have to account for things that we don't know how to explain, such as emergence, which is basically the system cannot be divided it's not the sum of all the parts. Mm-hmm. There are things that are happening, we don't understand why. It can be grains of sand and how they make these shapes basically with the waves,
the patterns on the vibration.
Yeah, exactly. That we cannot really explain. It's not the sum of all the grains of sand.
Right.
It's too many variables to model it. We just don't know how it works.
Yeah, that's
you
amazing.
have the birds that are flying in a certain way. You have emergent properties of systems that we cannot explain. Right. This is one thing. And on the other hand, we have also. Another movement that I would say is very small but growing, which is intelligent design. Mm-hmm. And I was watching Stephen Meyer's interview yesterday with Justin Brierley, and he said something interesting. He said our movement is less and less. He was not more and more popular, but less and less disliked or unpopular.
Interesting.
Or controversial.
Interesting.
And the idea is this.
He's not laughed off stage anymore.
Right. I think people start to realize more and more that their questions are valid, their books are good, their credentials are impeccable.
Legitimate, yeah.
Everything is legitimate, and at some point they're part of the scientific discussion.
Yeah, good.
Especially with the movie like The Story of Everything.
Good. Yeah, that's a great point.
Watch it on the streaming platforms this summer, by the way. In any case, there's these two movements that I think will converge to the same, I guess, new scientific method that will have to account for design identification and design recognition, pattern recognition. This is what I suspect, this is what I wish could happen, but I think we have to account for detection of design at this point. We cannot avoid the fact that things don't appear to be designed, just like Darwin was claiming, and the things and as we claim until recently, but they're actually designed. No matter who designed it, this is irrelevant for now. But the question is can we continue doing science pretending it appears to be designed?
Yeah, that information does not indicate a mind, which it always does, as we experience
as far as we know.
As far as we know.
Yeah.
What a conspiratorial thing to believe.
Yeah, crazy.
Like
seriously.
Like this appears to be designed.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't believe that. It's like, what?
Yeah.
Like, what? Don't believe your eyes on this because it only appears to be designed. And it's like,
well,
and we're talking about like
the pool balls only appear to touch. That's what Hume said. It's the same thing.
It's again, and I think there's some base things here. Like that. This is not a hard story to read. Now, going through the data and the information and like the way that people will arrive at these conclusions, like it's necessary and good.
Yeah.
But those base motivations still exist. Like how conspiratorial to look at like a mountain or a range of islands like the Galapagos and be like, don't be fooled. Okay?
Yeah.
This looks exactly like you think it would if it was designed, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's like, so who is this conspiracy against?
Well,
like who's conspiring against you rather?
Yeah, it's a good
what
question.
do you believe? Like, what do you?
Well, Christianity has a great answer for that. I don't know that we have the space to get into it right now. This circles back to everything is theology, doesn't it? Though, because the Christian worldview has an answer for that question.
Yeah.
Alternative worldviews do not provide a satisfactory answer.
I think there's something that can book into it, which is that there is a difference that needs to be noted between skepticism and conspiracy, like and.
A difference or a similarity?
No, a difference.
Okay.
How? John Henry starts the chapter that we read all together about talking about the skepticism of authority and how like, we actually get some really great stuff out of that. Like Martin Luther, who mounts
by just asking questions.
Yeah. But like that's so. Martin Luther was skeptical, but and backed up his skepticism with a 99 thesis. It was like, these are my problems. Can you answer this? What's the problem here? And but I would say what Darwin is presenting is this radical conspiracy kind of mindset, which is like he's basically
he's
saying
not presenting that as if he's not saying he knows
Darwin.
it.
No, he's not saying he knows it. But
you're just making that.
He's presenting this saying that's not skepticism. To say, well, everything looks designed. but you shouldn't believe that. It's something different.
That's
That's a conclusion. That's not skepticism. He's drawing a conclusion about the nature of things from looking at it.
There's a professor of psychological and brain science at Boston University called Deborah Kellerman, and she writes articles and books on something she calls intuitive theism and how to, and it's for kids, very often her books, you can find them on Amazon, unfortunately, but it's basically helping parents how to detach their kids from this intuition of design.
Good gracious.
It's really, really destructive.
Yeah.
Well,
It's exactly what you said, like, it looks designed, no. It looks created, no.
No, that's
Do not believe your eyes.
That is such a
Crazy.
ends justify the mean, building from your conclusion outward
Totally.
kind of mindset. And I've
It's
thought
not
that
the inference.
To the best explanation.
Yeah, it's not that at all.
True. Yeah,
because the premise you have to start with and maybe it's just too big of a bite to take off, but like the premise I was actually raised to think like this. The premise you have to bite off to start to take part in Darwinian evolution and the thinking deeply and like believing this and using the system is that you have none. There's a bit of a conspiracy, like against you. That's how it felt. Like you are being tricked. The universe isn't intelligible. You shouldn't trust it. You shouldn't know. You shouldn't be confident in who you are and what the world is.
And do you know what Darwin was struggling the most in his writings, in his letters that are available on darwinproject.org, by the way, very interesting. And in his book, The Origin of Species, he was struggling a lot with the problem of evil. He constantly, as he uses this as an argument. Like, for example, when he's analyzing like an animal, whatever, it's like, how could God have created this process where this gets eaten by that? This is definitely not created.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is just
he does probably 10 times in the book.
But he denies basic theology, which explains that. So if he was just a little bit more familiar with his Bible, not to like truncate that. But
I'll get in trouble because that makes me it literally gets me angry.
Yeah.
Like going like we've had this guy stuck on the stinking plate of scholarly dialogue for this long, and he's so obviously so biased. And asking you to jump off this cliff with him of no, essentially the world isn't as it seems. This seems
for his defense.
Classic.
No, I'm
Classic
not. I'm not really defending him, but
No.
I just want to defend him from the standpoint of what science is. If it really is this closed area where you can only study things, materialistically, and it's a constrained area that cannot study miracles, for example, right? Then the problem that they really were facing in the mid-19th century is they had two different competing accounts. They had Genesis and they had Darwin. And so from a scientific perspective, it is rigorous to say the only materialistic explanation that I have is my bad explanation, and we're going to adopt it and go with it. Mm-hmm. But we should just be honest about that status, the status of us.
He's been venerated.
Keeping it on the table just because it's the only one we have, but it doesn't justify building on top of that and saying it is obviously true, therefore let's invest more and let's study more how penguins come out of ants, So that's really it's just a matter of honesty.
Yeah. It's good. That's a great point.
Growing up in the South, they would call this putting lipstick on a pig. It's just you're just
trying to make someone look good that just doesn't.
It's just not good, and then they're telling you to like hook, line. Okay, and I'm probably if there's skeptics watching, you can trash me in the comments. You can say I'm an idiot. I don't mind, but I'm
gonna trash you in the comments.
Yeah, Taylor's making a fake account. And he's gonna trash me in the comments. But I get passionate about it because it just feels so insistent on a bad idea.
Yeah.
And but pulling back out of that into the subject matter that we're landing on.
Yeah, because we got to
which is like, what does it look like in the future? Like, what is it? Reading John Henry's account, I saw the beginning of the same kind of environment that he was talking about with the scientific revolution, where there was an Aristotelian
dogma
entrenchment in the university that was just under assault by these pretty much outside groups that were assimilating without without state funding and without, like, they were kind of finding patrons. They were doing this outside of their tutelage, and
Hashtag Discover Institute.
Yeah, and there were, and this is another thing. There were multiple groups in different countries that John Henry's talking about. Like, this is the Academia, or it's French, Académie. John
Des Sciences.
The Bacon's group, and there are more that I'm missing, but they were doing this stuff guerrilla style outside of the public eye, and then all of a sudden, it just flipped. The narrative flipped on the Aristotelians because they didn't have data to back up what they were saying. Yeah. And I think that
that's the future.
That's the future. If they'll
independent scientific institutes rather than government-owned institutes, I guess.
And intellectual honesty would be a key ingredient of that.
And good science.
And good science.
Good data, good thinking, like consistent thinking in the same direction, a long time practicing science honestly, not trying to, jigger the results at all, just doing the science. Like, it actually becomes less theological and less like, oh, the church is ascending. It's like, just do this, just do science.
Yeah.
Just do it. And ultimately the data will show. The results will come out. I actually think that this is a little bit almost like it's kind of, I would say it's inevitable. If humanity is to continue existing, it's inevitable for there to be a flip, at least on the current scientific dogma.
So the risk that we are facing right now is because of globalization. We are sharing a lot of trades and ways of doing things with other countries that do not have the same dogma. For example, I remember in Darwin's Doubt by Meyer, there's a very famous professor. He was coming from China, and he was very surprised by how much pushback there was to have like novel ideas in evolutionary biology in the US. And he was basically saying, well, in China we can ask different types of questions, and question the whole thing if we want to, right? But here it's so entrenched, as we were saying, that we are limiting ourselves. Therefore, there's a risk that the new science the new revolution will maybe take place in another wealthy and open-minded society. Which one it is? It might be us if we wake up, but it might be another country that has been basically tapping into that Western way of doing science.
Bring it on.
Such as China, for example.
Yeah.
But so far,
bring it on.
Interestingly, when I was doing my research during my research studies in Polytechnique in Paris, I had a group of colleagues that were going to China to, what's this famous city famous for COVID?
Wuhan.
Yeah, they were going to Wuhan, and they were teaching there, and they were really appalled by the profile of the students. And the reason is that the students were very good at just telling, if you told them what to do, they would just do it. But if you ask them to be creative and to like find new ways of solving a problem, whatever, they would just be stuck. The culture is not there yet. You have probably most the best students, Chinese students, are probably still coming to the US, coming to Europe. But there's going to be a tipping point at some point if we don't course correct, where the good science, the healthy, non-dogmatic, open-minded science will take place somewhere else by someone else, because we are not going to be able to make advancements if we are not more open-minded about the possibilities. Like Newton was, Kepler, Copernicus.
I have no problem with that. I have an undergraduate professor, Dr. Jonathan Armstrong, who said, if you want to influence the theology that happens in the next 100 years, which is it's related to your comment, then go teach theology in Africa or in South Korea, because that's where good theology is going to come. Bad theology has come from the West for a long, long time, and we're not course correcting.
Especially theology.
So good theology. If you want to affect the theology that your grandchildren hear, go teach theology in Korea or in Africa, because that's where it's going to be done. And I think that's the point that you're getting at from a scientific perspective as well. And I have no problem with that.
And I would take it
personally.
I would take what you're saying, and I just continue like boom, boom, and a level deeper. And I think it's because that theology is welcome in those places, because there's an actual hunger for.
That's interesting.
There's an actual hunger for.
So you're saying
for an inner.
So you're saying that a more theologically orthodox worldview, which is occurring in Africa and in Asia more than it is here, actually might be that thing which is necessary for the scientific revolution to actually take its next step?
Deeper.
Ooh, deeper than that.
deeper, that the theological environment
Yeah.
for a scientific revolution,
True scientific revolution.
for a true scientific revolution, comes from a people group that's actually hungry to experience God and nature in its right order.
Come on.
Ooh, that's even deeper.
Come
And
on.
so they
Come
are.
on. I'm so ready
they-
for that.
I want to go deeper. Hold on.
I'm so ready.
he's like
No, I'm so,
explosion of light.
No, no.
Into
I'm
the
ready.
podcast. We're done.
I'm ready. That was good.
We
that
get
was really
swept
good.
up or something. But the a chariot kind of flies by. we digress. No, my point is this.
Glory, glory. This is what I meant.
Yeah. No, I think that there's a true hunger for this is gonna sound almost dumb. There's a true hunger for rightness
Yeah.
because of how unright and how and there are so many ingredients as to why a place like Africa is in a place that's hungry for right action and fairness and goodness, and they've been exposed to the worst of the worst human issues by the West in large part,
Right.
by the East, actually China as well.
No,
that we
but
see
but,
now.
but those are just adopted
But-
Western ideals.
Yeah, I mean,
Marxism and the
just-
like. Yeah.
They've suffered.
Yeah.
They've suffered. They've
Absolutely.
really suffered,
That's
and now
true.
they're
Marxism is a really bad legacy.
Let's
and
go-
South
let's go
America.
for that one.
And
Let's
South
cut-
America.
Let's cut that.
It's
throat.
lighting up
Let's
too.
cut that throat in a future episode.
Yeah.
Just to actually clarify
Marxism,
what
yeah.
you're saying, because I was talking about
The throat of Marxism.
Okay, there we go.
Let's cut that throat on a future
Okay.
episode.
But so to really land my idea,
Yeah.
there is where there's deep hunger for God and deep hunger for goodness and there's a hopefulness that things can be better, is where good theology is grown, because people order their minds and their lives after a God that loves order.
And by extension, good
Science.
Yeah.
Yeah, come on. That's
And
good.
then
Brah,
and
pow,
in
pow.
so much and in that no brain is left behind.
Yeah, and then
No brain is left behind.
Praise God.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. That's the end of the episode. Thank you so much, and see you next time.